Call came at 2047 in the morning, and I almost didn't answer it. I'd been asleep maybe 3 hours, which wasn't unusual for me anymore. When you get to my age, sleep becomes something you negotiate with rather than something you have. I'd taken my blood pressure pill, turned off the television in the middle of some cooking show, and settled in with the lamp still on and a book I hadn't actually read a word of in 2 weeks. The phone buzzing on the nightstand made my heart do that thing it does now. That little lurch, that animal knowing before your brain catches up. The number was a Houston area code I didn't recognize. I answered it anyway. Mom, I'm calling from Memorial Home and Hospital in Houston. I'm looking for the family of a patient named Owen Calloway. My son. My only child. I was out of bed before I even fully understood what the woman on the other end was telling me. Something about critical condition. Something about being admitted 3 days ago. 3 days. I gripped the phone so hard, I thought the case might crack. 3 days? I said. He's been there 3 days. Yes, Mum. His wife was listed as the primary emergency contact. We've been in touch with her. But given the change in his condition tonight, we felt it was important to reach his next of kin as well. I stood in my bedroom in Savannah, Georgia, in my nightgown at 2047 in the morning, and I asked the question I was terrified to ask. Is he going to make it? The pause before she answered told me everything I needed to know about how bad it was. I booked the first flight out of Savannah Hilton Head at 5:15 a.m. I didn't pack carefully. I threw things into a bag, 2 changes of clothes, my medication, my reading glasses, the folder I keep in my top dresser drawer with copies of important documents. Owen had given me medical power of attorney 2 years ago, after his father passed, and we'd both sat with the paperwork the way you do when grief teaches you practical lessons. I didn't know then that I'd ever need to use it. I took it anyway. I didn't call my daughter-in-law Misty on the way to the airport. I told myself it was because it was the middle of the night. But if I'm being honest, which I promised myself I would be when I decided to tell this story, there was another reason. Something in the way the nurse had said, "We've been in touch with her," past tense, careful and flat, sat wrong with me. Like she was telling me something without telling me something. I'd never fully trusted Misty. And that's a hard thing to say about the woman your child chose to marry, and I spent years trying to sand down that feeling, telling myself I was just a mother who had trouble letting go. Owen loved her. Owen said she was the one, and Owen was a careful person, a measured person. He'd spent 15 years building his financial planning practice from nothing, and he didn't make decisions carelessly. I tried to trust his judgment, but there was always something. The way she'd changed his phone password without mentioning it. The way Owen's friends from college stopped coming around after the wedding. The way she answered questions about her own family with a vagueness that made me feel rude for asking. And when my husband Raymond passed 3 years ago, when Owen flew home to Savannah and sat with me at the kitchen table and we cried together for 2 days, Misty had not come. She'd sent flowers and a card that said "so sorry for your loss" in handwriting that looked like a store clerk's. I told myself it was grief that made me uncharitable. I told myself a lot of things. The flight to Houston was 2 hours and change. I sat in the window seat and watched the sun come up over the Georgia coast and prayed in a way I hadn't since Raymond's last days in the hospital. Not formal prayer, just the raw kind. The kind where you're not sure anyone is listening, but you say it anyway because there's nothing else to do with the fear. Owen was 39 years old. He coached youth baseball on Saturday mornings. He called me every Sunday at noon, and we talked for at least 45 minutes. Sometimes longer if the week had been interesting. He'd had a cold 3 weeks ago. He'd mentioned being tired, a little run down, but the way you mention it when you're brushing it off, the way working people do when they don't want to slow down. I'd told him to get some rest. I'd told him to drink fluids. 3 days in the ICU, and no one had called me. I took a cab from George Bush Intercontinental straight to the hospital. I didn't stop to check into a hotel. I walked into the ICU waiting area at just past 8 in the morning with my overnight bag over my shoulder and asked for my son. The charge nurse, a broad-shouldered woman named Janet, who turned out to be one of the kindest people I've ever encountered in a medical setting, walked me to Owen's room herself. On the way, she told me quietly that he'd been admitted with bacterial pneumonia that had progressed to sepsis, that he'd been on a ventilator for 24 hours, that he'd been unconscious and sedated, and that the previous 48 hours had been, in her careful words, very difficult. I asked her about his wife. Janet looked at the hallway ahead of us for a moment before she answered. She was here the first day, she said. She left a number. We've called it when there have been updates. She hasn't been back. Not since Tuesday. It was Friday. I walked into my son's room and I nearly lost my legs. He looked nothing like himself. He was pale in a way that didn't look like sickness so much as absence, like the color had simply been removed from him. There were tubes and lines, and the rhythmic sound of the ventilator breathing for him, and the monitors casting everything in a faint blue light. His hands were lying at his sides on top of the blanket, and they were the hands I'd held when he was small, the same hands that had learned to throw a baseball and type and shake clients' hands. And they were so still. I sat down in the chair beside him, and I took his hand in both of mine, and I put my forehead down, and I cried in a way I hadn't let myself cry on the plane, in the cab, in the hallway. A mother's cry. The kind that comes from somewhere so deep it doesn't make sound at first, just shakes. After a while, I stopped shaking, and I started talking to him. I told him I was there. I told him his father would be furious with him for scaring me like this. I told him I had absolutely no plans to leave. The attending physician came by mid-morning. He was a quiet, serious man who spoke to me with the kind of careful directness I appreciated, like he respected me enough not to soften things into mush. Owen's infection was severe. The next 48 to 72 hours would be critical. They had him on powerful antibiotics and were managing his blood pressure and watching his kidneys. He'd been found by a neighbor who'd seen his car in the driveway for 3 days and hadn't seen him come outside. The neighbor had knocked, gotten no answer, and eventually called for a wellness check. A neighbor, not his wife. I asked the doctor when Owen's wife had last been at the hospital. He glanced at the chart, the way people do when the chart contains information they've been careful not to volunteer. Mrs. Calloway was here Monday evening, he said. And today is Friday. He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. I called Missy from the family waiting room. She answered on the fourth ring, and there was noise behind her. Music, voices, the hollow acoustics of a large indoor space. Ruth, she said. She always called me Ruth, never Mum, though Owen had asked her to more than once. I was going to call you. Were you? I said. It's been so hard, she said. I couldn't sit in that hospital anymore. I couldn't stand watching him like that. It was tearing me apart. The noise behind her didn't sound like someone torn apart. It sounded like a bar, or a restaurant, or somewhere people went to not think about the person they'd left on a ventilator alone. I asked her where she was. She said she was just out with some girlfriends, just trying to get her head together. I said I was at the hospital with our son and that I would be staying. There was a pause, then, "Oh, you didn't have to fly all the way down." I stood in that waiting room for a long moment after I hung up, looking out the window at the parking structure across the street. I thought about Raymond. I thought about the way he'd sat beside Owen's bed when Owen had his appendix out at 16, the way he'd fallen asleep in the chair still holding Owen's hand. I thought about what it means to love someone, really love someone, the kind that doesn't calculate what it's costing you. Then I took the folder out of my bag. Owen had given me power of attorney while he was lucid and legally competent, 2 years prior, notarized and filed with his attorney. It covered medical decisions and, in the event of his incapacitation, certain financial matters. Specifically, it included authorization to protect his assets if he was unable to do so himself, and if there was reasonable cause to believe those assets were at risk. I never had reason to look too closely at exactly what Misty had access to. I knew they had joint accounts. I knew Owen's practice was profitable. I knew he'd done well. I called Owen's attorney, a man named Douglas Hart, who'd handled the estate planning and who answered his cell phone on a Friday morning because I'd worked with him when Raymond passed, and he knew I wasn't the kind of person who called without cause. I told him the situation. I told him Owen was in the ICU and had been for 4 days and that his wife had been absent for most of that time and that I had concerns. Douglas was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Ruth, let me pull up his file." What Douglas told me over the next 20 minutes made me grip the phone the same way I had at 2:47 that morning. Owen, careful, methodical, Owen who didn't make decisions carelessly, had updated his will and his beneficiary designations 14 months ago. He had not told me. He had, however, told Douglas that he was doing so as a precaution, which was the word Douglas used, saying it with the same careful flatness the hospital nurse had used about Misty not coming back. I didn't ask Douglas what the precaution was for. I think I already knew. What I did ask him was what we could do right now, today, to make sure nothing moved out of Owen's accounts while he was incapacitated. Douglas walked me through it. With the power of attorney and Owen's state of documented incapacitation, we could file to freeze certain accounts pending his recovery, or, if the worst happened, pending proper probate. It wasn't instant, but Douglas had a contact at Owen's bank, a regional institution where Owen had banked since he was in his 20s, and he made some calls. By Friday afternoon, the joint accounts had a hold placed on them pending legal review. At 6:18 that evening, my phone rang. It was Misty. She was not torn apart anymore. She was not soft-voiced and sad. She was screaming, actually screaming that I had no right, that I had gone behind her back, that she was Owen's wife and I was just his mother, and who did I think I was coming down here and interfering in their marriage? I let her finish. Then I said, "If you'd like to discuss it further, you're welcome to come to the hospital. Owen is in room 42012. He's been there since Monday." She hung up. She did not come to the hospital that night. She did not come the next day either, which was the day Owen's fever broke for the first time, and Janet came in with a look on her face that was the closest thing to joy I'd seen in days. And I held my son's hand and told him he was doing better, and I wasn't entirely sure he could hear me, but I believed he could. He couldn't talk, the ventilator was still in, but on Saturday afternoon something changed in his face, a tension releasing. His eyes opened partway, unfocused but open, and then they found me, and something moved in them. Recognition, not surprise, just there, like some part of him had known I'd be there and was simply confirming it. I stayed. I slept in the chair beside him. I ate the food Janet brought me from the nurse's station and felt embarrassed about how grateful I was for it. I talked to Owen through the nights, rambling mostly, telling him about the garden, about the neighbour's dog who kept getting into my tomatoes, about the Sunday crossword I'd been struggling with, ordinary things, the texture of the life that was waiting for him when he came back to it. Misty came on Sunday, 9 days after he'd been admitted. She walked in while I was sitting beside Owen, reading aloud from the sports section because he'd always loved baseball scores, and I'd thought it might reach him. She was dressed like she was going somewhere nice afterward, which maybe she was. She stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at Owen, and then she looked at me with an expression I can only describe as calculating, like she was doing some kind of internal math. "He looks better," she said. "He's better," I said. "I said he's been improving since Saturday." She sat in the chair on the other side of the bed. She didn't take his hand. She sat with her hands in her lap and looked at the monitors, and after a few minutes she said, "I talked to a lawyer about what you did." "I'm sure you did," I said. "He said you overstepped." "He's welcome to take that up with Douglas Hart." She looked at me for a long moment. There was something behind her eyes that I'd spent years not wanting to name. I named it now, quietly, to myself. It wasn't grief. It wasn't even anger exactly. It was the look of someone who had made a plan and was watching the plan become complicated. "He's going to want me here when he wakes up," she said. "When he wakes up," I said, "he can tell me that himself." Owen was extubated 11 days after he was admitted. The first thing he said in a voice like gravel and rust was my name, not her name. Mine. He recovered slowly, the way you recover from something that has genuinely tried to kill you. Physical therapy, breathing exercises, the steady, unglamorous work of rebuilding. I rented a furnished apartment in Houston for 6 weeks, a plain one-bedroom 20 minutes from the hospital, the kind of place with thin walls and adequate furniture, and I didn't mind it at all. Misty came to the hospital 3 more times during his recovery. Brief visits, phone in hand for most of them. Owen didn't ask me about the frozen accounts right away. He asked about them on the 2nd week of his recovery, when he was sitting up and eating solid food and had the energy to think about things beyond breathing. I told him everything. The call at 2:47, the flight, what the doctor told me about when she'd last been there, the phone call where I'd heard the music in the background. He listened without interrupting me, which was always his way. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time, looking out the window at the Houston skyline. "I updated the will 14 months ago," he said. "I know," Douglas told me. "I should have told you," he paused. "I kept hoping I was wrong about her." I reached over and put my hand on his arm. I didn't say anything about being right. It wasn't the time for that, and it wasn't the point. The divorce was filed 4 months later. I won't pretend it was simple or clean. It wasn't. Misty hired an aggressive attorney and contested the asset protection measures, and there were months of back and forth that cost Owen time and money and energy he needed for his health. But Douglas was good, and Owen's documentation was thorough, and the will he'd updated 14 months ago with the quiet precaution of a man who'd already seen what he was dealing with. That held. In the end, Misty received what she was legally entitled to from the years of the marriage. She did not receive what she'd appeared to be planning for. She moved out of the Houston house, and Owen sold it and bought a smaller place in a neighborhood he'd always liked, with a porch where he put a bird feeder and started sleeping better. There's a boy in Owen's youth baseball league named Cooper. 12 years old, has a good arm, comes from a single-parent household where money is tight. Owen has been paying for Cooper's equipment and league fees for 2 years now, quietly, the way his father would have done it. He told me about it on one of our Sunday calls, almost as an aside, like it wasn't remarkable. I had to set the phone down for a minute and collect myself. Raymond used to say that the way you find out who someone really is, you watch them when things get hard. You watch what they do when it costs them something. I found out who my son was in a hospital room in Houston. I already knew who he was, if I'm honest, but I found out again the way you sometimes need to. And I found out something about myself, too, that I am not the kind of woman who waits by the phone, that I am not too old to pack a bag in the dark and get on a plane before the sun comes up, that whatever I am at this age, tired sometimes, slower than I was, missing Raymond every single day, I am still his mother. I was always going to come. The bird feeder on Owen's porch gets emptied every few days. He sends me pictures sometimes, on Sunday mornings before he calls. The cardinals mostly, a pair of them that have made a habit of coming. He says they remind him of his father. I think they do too. I keep thinking about that chair beside Owen's bed, the vinyl one with the armrest that dug into my side if I leaned the wrong way. I slept in it 4 nights in a row, and I would sleep in it 400 more if I had to. And that's not something I say to make myself sound like a good mother. I say it because I don't think I had a choice. When your child is in that bed, you don't weigh the cost. You're just there. That's what love actually looks like when you strip everything else away. Not the flowers, not the card with the store clerk's handwriting, not the phone call you were going to make. Just presence. Just showing up when showing up is the hardest thing. What happened to Owen didn't happen because Misty was a mystery. Looking back, the signs were there for years. I just kept talking myself out of trusting them. I told myself I was being unfair. I told myself grief and suspicion look alike sometimes. But there's a difference between being uncharitable and being honest. And I spent too long on the wrong side of that line. Owen had already seen it clearly enough to update his will 14 months before any of this. He was careful. He was methodical. He did what a person with good judgment does when they understand a situation they can't yet fully act on. He prepared. That kind of quiet foresight, the kind that doesn't announce itself, is its own form of wisdom. It protected him when he couldn't protect himself. And I think about the neighbor who called for the wellness check. Some person who simply noticed that Owen's car had been in the driveway for 3 days, and something felt wrong. That neighbor didn't know Owen well. They didn't have a legal obligation. They acted because their moral instinct told them to, because they understood without being taught that we have some responsibility to the people living alongside us. That small, unremarkable act of human decency is what got Owen to the hospital in time. I never learned that neighbor's name. I think about them anyway. What I know now, more clearly than I did before any of this, is that character doesn't hold up under pressure. It reveals itself under pressure. Misty didn't become someone different when Owen got sick. She showed me who she had always been. And Owen didn't become strong in that hospital room. He'd been building that strength for years, in every careful decision, every quiet precaution, every Sunday phone call where he asked how I was doing and actually waited for the answer. I'm not the same woman I was before that 2:47:47 phone call. Something in me that had been going soft. The part that second guesses, that defers, that waits to be sure. That part hardened back into something useful. I am 63 years old, and I packed a bag in the dark and got on a plane before sunrise, and I did what needed to be done. I didn't do it because I was fearless. I did it because being afraid and doing it anyway is the only kind of courage that's ever mattered to me. Raymond used to say that how you spend your ordinary days is how you'll spend your extraordinary ones. Owen spent his ordinary days being the kind of man who coaches 12-year-olds and pays for their equipment quietly and calls his mother every Sunday. That's not an accident. That's the result of 1,000 small choices made the right way over a long time when no one was watching. The cardinals come to his feeder most mornings now. He sends me the pictures, and I save everyone.